So, welcome back again. This time we are going to run the different jobs that were created in the job agent. So the workflow SQL is the one that created the staging job and the loading job. So first we're going to run the staging job, which populates the stage database with the data that can be found in the files that we had. So I'm going to start this job here. The staging job. As you can see all the steps here that it's doing. So I'm going to start it, and we're going to be looking at the results in any second. So what it's doing right now, it's taking the files, loading the files using bulk inserts into a raw table. So we're going to look at the raw table here. This is where the data ends up first. So let's select some rows from this table, and what you can see here is the data that comes out of the framework in the first step. So what it's doing, and this is how it's able to manage files in which all rows don't have the same structure. So it's basically reading the file row by row into a raw table. So you can be sure that whatever was found in the text file that you loaded will always be found in this raw table as well. So every row in the file can be seen here. So let's go back here and we can see which one. This one is May 1st. Here's May 2014. So I'm going to go back and we can look at the actual file. May, okay, it's in the beginning, there it's May. So this is the data that was loaded from this file into the raw table. And here it is in the raw table. So you can see it's the same thing. Every row gets a small identifier. This ID will follow through all of the staging, so you can actually get a lineage of the data, so you can see what it looked like in the raw table. If you suspect that something is wrong with the data, for example, you can go back and you can look at the actual row here and find which was the row that produced the error. You can so you have good capabilities for finding data quality problems, for example. So what happens after this is that this data that you see here in the raw table gets split into two other tables here in this case. And those two tables correspond to what you have defined in your source XML file. So in this file I defined two different parts. One's called collision and the other one collision metadata. And looking back at the database, you can see here that we have two tables. We have the collision table and the collision metadata table. So, and these are typed tables. So if you look at, for example, this one, the collision one, and look at the columns here, you can see here that the columns have the expected types that these terms have that you defined here. So here's a term called collision order, and it's a tiny int. If I go back here to the data, you can see here that where's collision order? There it is, collision order, and you can see that it is a tiny int. You can also see here that there's a key defined here on some of the columns. So the primary key here is consisting of three columns: collision order, intersecting street, and cross street. This key was also defined in this source XML file. So here's the key that you can see have been created also in the database. And that means, of course, if you have a key, there are no duplicates on this key here in the source, in the typed table here. So if there are indeed some data that couldn't be entered into this typed table that were available in this raw table, That data can also be identified and found. For example, if there was some number of collisions that couldn't fit into a tiny int. A tiny int can hold up to 255 collisions, but let's say that for some reason this month there were 260 collisions at a certain street crossing. Then that wouldn't fit, and then you would have an error in your data type that couldn't hold that. So that can be found if you look. This is the metadata structure that we talked about before. I'm going to come back to that later. If you look at the views here, there's also some views here that have a suffix called error. So if I look at this NYPD vehicle collision error view, and we select some rows from that one, this one will actually show you if there are offending rows, and there looks like there's a whole lot of offending rows. No, I'm sorry, maybe it wasn't just the rows. Oh, it should be something should be an error here. So let's see. Here you can see what text the match. This, of course, we use delimiters and stuff when we define the source XML here, but we had one, for example, which was a little bit more complicated pattern using a regular expression here. So if you look at the collision ID, you can see what the matching part, the one in parentheses here, what was the matching part in this case. It was occurring, what was it again? Collision ID. So let's see if we can find collision ID. Here's collision ID. You can see here, this is what it matched in the using the regular expression, and this is what ended up in the column. And if there was an error here, it would be a description here about of what type of error it would be. So far we haven't seen any errors. There's a null in all of the error ones, so let's continue. Oh, so what you can see here is that we have a duplicate here for this, and I suspect I know why. Because if I go back here and look at the key, you can see here that the key is just the intersecting street, the cross street, and the collision order. There's nothing in the key here identifying the actual date when this took place. So for a given month, now I'm loading 8 months here, which means that there are probably going to be collisions within the first month that also are available in the second month and the 7th and the 8th in August as well. So you can see here all of the errors that we have are actually duplicates. So these duplicates are not loaded into this table. Only one instance of that for that key is loaded here, and the other ones are still left behind. Okay, so now we have, of course I could extend the key there, but we'll do that later. We'll have a little look at this collision metadata table. I'm going to look at some rows from that one. And this has just extracted a few of the things that you could see in the header of the file, like which month and year are we talking about here, like in this case May, June, July, and August. And here are the notes that were found in the footer, I believe, of the file. Yep. So that's the data that was extracted from the headers and footers. So the next step is, of course, to get this data from the staging area into the actual data warehouse. And in our case, the data warehouse is in the traffic database. And I created in a previous video the different tables here from the model that you saw, and in here you can see that we have the intersections and the streets, etc. But right now these should be empty. There are no streets. Oh, wait a minute. Let's use the view here, latest view for the street, and select the data. You can see there's nothing there. So we'll run the loading job as well. There, start. And this is going to populate the traffic database with the data from the staging area. So we just wait a few seconds, and here we are. I'm going to run this query here again. And as you can see here, now it has been populated with the streets, all the different streets. If you remember, these streets can appear both as the intersecting or the crossing street when there's been a collision. Okay, so let's look at the intersection as well, which is the thing that ties together a couple of streets. So here's the intersections, and here you can see our measures, how many were injured, only one in that case. How many collisions were there at this particular intersection, 1 or 2. This was a tiny int, if you remember, so we don't want to see any more than 255 in that column. I think it's very unlikely that there would be more than 255 collisions at a single intersection in Manhattan during a month, but you never know. So in that case, you would just change the data type in the metadata, and next time you run the framework, you will have the larger data type instead. So now that we've run this, we will next look at some of the lineage, also at the metadata that is created during this process, and we'll also go back and look at because we only looked at the source XML here, we're going to be looking closer also at the target XML here. This XML file is actually the loading of the anchor model, in this case it's doing a bit of aggregation in the loading step, because the source data is on a lower level than the data in the data warehouse. Otherwise, this could be even when you have just one-to-one mapping with respect to granularity, it's even simpler than this. But this file together with this file is basically everything that loads the data and populates the data warehouse. So we'll be looking at that in the next video. I'm going to leave you with that now and see you in the next one.